Okay, hi everyone. We're going to give this one more minute just to allow for some more people to join, and then we'll be with you. Okay, so I think we'll get started. Hello, everyone. We'll get going. Welcome to FNA's 7th FNI broadcast, I believe. Today, streaming live from Sevilla, where FNA is hosting its annual team get-together. So a very special broadcast today, and I guess a caveat in case somebody steams through this door or interrupts me. So there we go. Very special occasion for us all today. As always, thank you to everyone that's joined today. We've been doing these broadcasts now for across SupTech, CBDC, and FMI topics. We've been doing it for about a year now. Last year we had in fact, we had over 2,000 people join us for these sessions. So as always, thank you for your support and thank you for joining us today. So I'm Anthony. I look after marketing here at FNA. We have two amazing guests today covering what I believe is a very hot topic in the sector that I'm looking forward to getting into. Before we start, as usual, I will just cover some quick housekeeping and then we'll move on with the discussion. Next slide, please. No, sorry, previous slide, housekeeping first. So the broadcast typically follows a 60-minute format. We'll have a Q&A at the end of the session. If you'd like to ask a session, don't be shy, please do ask. However, I would ask that you use the Q&A widget at the bottom of the screen. Don't use the chat function because it's a lot harder to track the questions that way. And then during the Q&A session at the end, our guests will try and get through as many of them as we can. Alternatively, if your question doesn't get answered, please do get in touch with any of us. The details will be on the final slide. So next slide, please. Thank you. So for those of you who perhaps aren't aware of FNA, maybe this is your first session, I'll just explain very quickly what we do. So FNA is an advanced analytics and simulation technology company. We work across four key sectors, core sectors, if you will, namely central banks, commercial banks, FMIs, and national security. So our software is solution-based per sector. So where a central bank might use our technology for understanding the impact of launching a CBDC, a commercial bank will also use the same underlying technology to optimize their liquidity in real time. So as this is an FMI broadcast, the next slide just digs down a little bit further into our FMI lifecycle solutions. The background, of course, to this is that macro trends are, well, including an increase in oversight and regulation, and new disruptive technologies. These are all things that are forcing FMIs to invest in the future and to optimize their systems. So FMIs, challenger FMIs, new age FMIs, payment systems, all use our FMI lifecycle solutions to support every phase of their journey. So whether that's from designing and validating system design, building business cases for their members, right through to monitoring, stress testing, optimizing, they use our FMI lifecycle solution. So a typical engagement will include the creation of a digital twin of the FMI, allowing users to test new technology features, changes, or indeed stresses to the system. We also deliver synthetic data sets, enabling FMIs to run simulations and tests with accurate and secure data. Also real-time dashboards for monitoring the system, which provide full analysis of payment flows, emerging liquidity issues and anomalies, and more. So if there's anything on this slide that perhaps piques your interest, please do get in touch with the team. Again, details will be available on the last slide. So I think we'll move on to our discussion. I'm going to hand you over to Carlos Leon, who works here as Director of FMI and Digital Currency Solutions. Carlos is now going to introduce you to our speakers, and then we'll get the discussion kicked off. So Carlos, over to you.
Thank you, Anthony. Thank you, Saskia. Thank you, John. Thank you, everyone, for being with us today at the FMI broadcast number 7. Let me introduce, please, first, John Jackson. John Jackson is Policy and Product Lead, RTGS Renewal Program at Bank of England. John is the Policy and Product Lead for the RTGS Renewal Program, working at the Bank of England's Banking, Payment and Innovation Directorate. And we have Saskia Devolder, Strategic Program Director of Cross-Border Payments at SWIFT. Saskia was appointed head of Western and Central Europe in September 2017. She's also responsible for SWIFT, GPI, and market infrastructures across EMEA countries. So, Saskia, John, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Carlos.
Thank you. The title of our subject today is the following. It's a global standard for payment messaging. Everything you need to know about ISO 20022. So we're going to be moving around this very interesting subject. So let me introduce a little bit about this. ISO 20022 is expected to create a global and open message standard across all business lines in the financial industry. Several long-lived financial communication standards, such as ISO 15022, which is for cross-border security settlement, ISO 8583, which is for credit and debit transactions, empty messages, which are the SWIFT proprietary for corresponding banking and FX transactions, will be replaced with a new standard. In fact, several central banks already have that, but it's becoming a standard as we speak. So ISO 222 is right around the corner. Migration will begin supposedly in March 2023, and it's expected to end, as far as we know, November 2025. Today, we're going to discuss key features and expectations around the adoption of this standard. Our guest speakers, Saskia and John, are going to talk we are going to discuss about how ISO 222 can change the financial ecosystem as we know it. So once again, John, Saskia, thank you very much for joining us. First question has to do to have like an icebreaker just to start. Can you tell us how are you both related to the adoption of ISO 222 from your positions at Bank of England and SWIFT? Let's start with you, John. Thank you.
Thanks, Carlos. Thanks for having the opportunity to come and speak here. Yeah, from my perspective, you introduced that I'm product lead on the renewal program. That's a kind of really big fundamental change we're making to our RTGS service, kind of completely replacing the existing system with a new one. When we kicked off the work on that several years ago, the first thing we did was went and asked our participants, current and prospective future participants, what did they want our RTGS service, this thing that sits at the heart of electronic payment settlement in the UK. What did they want it? How did they want it to change? What did they want it to look like in future? And ISO 20022 kind of came out top of the list for almost all the participants. They said that, this is a difficult thing to do, but if you're renewing your system, this is the perfect time to move to this emerging global standard for wholesale or for payments messaging generally. And so since that point, as part of my role and the team's role, making sure that we've got the right vision, we're trying to develop the right things. I think it's always been the case that making sure we have the technological capability to adopt ISO 20022, making sure we kind of bring our participants on the journey with us and we figure out what the ISO standard, and how to configure it for the UK has been kind of crucial to getting the benefits of renewing RTGS.
Thank you, John. Very interesting. Saskia, what about you?
Well, indeed, I'm responsible at SWIFT for cross-border payments in the strategy team, but also for the G20 agenda. And if I maybe start with SWIFT itself, SWIFT has been for decades providing cross-border payments capabilities. And that starts with having, of course, a global network, having 11,000 customers connecting securely and resiliently. And that goes from banks to market infrastructures like the Bank of England, but also CSDs, asset managers, corporates, and others. But of course, also at that time, it's about standards. In order to communicate with each other around the globe, you need to all agree on one common language. And by the way, the best demonstration, I think, is today. I don't know about you, Carlos, but my mother language is Dutch. So if I would speak Dutch, probably most of the people in this call would not get me. So we have all decided to talk English. So that's already a little bit of an example of why having a common language is important. And correct to what you said earlier, there's more features to ISO 20022 than just having a common language, but I'm sure we'll come to that. So the language is quite important. And then I also refer to the G20. And I think most of you might know the G20 program, where they have, first of all, the 19 building blocks, where they are looking at what can everybody together do, and the G20, especially sponsoring by FSB, CPMI, what can we do to enhance cross-border payments for customers, being corporates and consumers, and make them more transparent, faster, cheaper? Well, ISO 20022 is one of the elements to guarantee interoperability on a global scale. And as we'll come later to that, are some of the features like more data and more structured data that should help with the ability for everyone to process them faster, correcter, and hence increase the speed and the cost element of doing cross-border payments.
That's great, Saskia. Thank you very much. Let's go to the next, to the first question, in fact. I know ISO 20022 sounds like a new thing, but it's not new. I even know that the Central Bank of Colombia already has the ISO 20022 implemented in their large value payment system, and most financial institutions already use it. Can you tell us a little bit about the story behind the development of ISO 20022? Let's start with you, Saskia.
Yes, well, the story behind it's correct, it's not new. Actually, I had to ask myself, my colleagues who are longer at SWIFT, where does this come from? And actually what I got is that it's an answer to a barrier of the Alberto Giovanni group report, which the report was called Cross-Border Clearing and Settlement Arrangement in the European Union, issued in 2001, and ISO 20022 was an answer to that. And that barrier was about national differences in information technology and interfaces. And, you know, everybody should minimize, we should be minimized by standardization. So that's already a long time ago. SWIFT was nominated the registration authority for this standard in 2004. What that means is that we work also with the community, everybody around SWIFT and all the working groups around it to define the messages. You have to know that there are about 800 ISO 20022 messages around. So, you know, working with that standard, you need to define what elements are important for what type of business. Not everybody has the same requirements. So it takes a time to design them, make sure they're there. And I think if you want to know, the one that probably a lot of people know is the SEPA use of ISO 20022. And that's probably the one that I would say most people know, SEPA being implemented in Europe. And so I think that's one of the most visible implementations of ISO 20022 so far. And it's true that certain countries have already implemented ISO 20022, but probably not the same version as the one to which most market infrastructures will actually move to and in the coming years. But that's, I think, something we can discuss later on a little bit. And then correct, I think you referred to the MT messages. SWIFT had designed, so a long time ago, the MT messages that everybody knows, the MT 103 and all those. And so we're moving also that cross-border bit to ISO 20022 to the standards. So yes, it's new on the level more of implementation, but the ISO standard itself exists since a long time.
Thank you, Saskia. John, what can you tell us about this?
Yeah, that was really interesting to actually hear it linked back to the Giovannini barriers. I didn't realize that. The two things I would add to that story is just one thing is to say that, as Saskia says, it's sort of new and not new because it's been in the pipeline for a long time and been adopted in other places. But it's certainly very new compared to what it's replacing, because I think a lot of the standards it's going to end up replacing in retail payments and in wholesale payments literally go back to kind of telex type era, which is a sign of how hard it is to update on these things over time, and what a big effort and how much coordination you need. So I think the one thing I was going to say on the story is to say it's a genuine step change from the previous standards we've been using, which were, I think, you know, in the best case developed in the 1970s, in the worst case before that. And then I think the second thing I would say is that the little bit of the story I would add in is the story about, there's one thing to have the standard, and then there's another thing to have your kind of market practice worked out underneath the standard. And an important development I wanted to note was the setting up of the HVPS Plus group, or the High Value Payment Systems group, which was, I think, set up between SWIFT and various central banks and commercial banks, including Bank of England, in 2016. And 2 or 3 years thinking carefully about how you would want to use the ISO 20022 standard for payments that would involve RTGS systems, other financial market infrastructures, kind of wholesale payments. And I think the important thing is not just that there's ISO 20022, but there are kind of market practice guidances underneath it that enable people like ourselves in CAPS or Target 2, Edwire, or Links in other, or system in to adopt the same flavor of ISO 20022, or something very close to the same flavor. And I think an important story was the development of that HVP Plus group, and alongside the CVPR Plus group, think about the ISO kind of market practice for correspondent banking, and that those two things are very well aligned. Off the journey of some of the bets we're going to talk about making things interoperable. So excited to have John, scientific the history.
John, we're having a little bit of problem, or at least I don't know if it's just me, but we're having like it's a little bit like broken the communication. Let's try. I mean, let's try to the next one to see if it continues, or we can perhaps you can change. I know that you have like a backup system, as all RTGS systems do. So let's try. So in the meantime, let's go to the next question, which I will start with Saskia to see if you can do something about it. So let's start with perhaps with one of the main questions about the ISO 20022, which is, what are the main benefits of implementing the ISO 20022? As John mentioned, it's not only to have the standard, it's to have the market practice. I mean, everyone getting into the implementation or to working with the ISO 20022. So what are the main benefits of everyone working with the ISO 20022? Saskia, thank you.
Thank you, Carlos. Well, I have a few points. The first one, I would say it's an open standard. It can be used by anybody, and anybody can contribute. So even if you're not working with the Bank of England, with SWIFT, with anybody else, you can use the standard. It's an open standard for everybody to support it, to contribute, to implement, to use. The second thing, it's a methodology. It's a standard that not only works for messaging, it also works for API. It's a common language for machines and for people to exchange information. So you can, for those that want to, see an ISO message, there is a book out there, ISO 20022 for Dummies, where you see the content of an ISO 20022 message. Actually, you can read it. So it's you and a machine that can read it, and it's a common language with a dictionary. Like, English has a dictionary, Dutch has a dictionary. So it's really a common language. Like I mentioned earlier, there are already over 800 messages defined, and there's more on the way. As soon as there is, a community or a group of people doing a certain business that need ISO 20022 messages defined among them, they can do that. Another big benefit, or what is maybe going back to John's point, there have been a lot of messages before. We have been exchanging cross-border payments with market infrastructure like the Bank of England and between banks for decades. But in those messages, the fields allowing for different elements, like what do you do generally put into a message? If I send you, Carlos, some money, I mean, it's who I am, and what is my address and all those things, who you are, and where the money needs to go, and what is the amount, what is the currency, all those kind of things. In the messages that everybody uses today, the place to do that is limited. So what happens sometimes is if you have a very long name, there might be cutoffs in your name because the standard could only due to the computers at that time, the capability of processing at that time was limited. So hence the information in those messages was limited. Now with ISO 20022, that changes. There is much more ability to add information, and not only to have within the fields that you need to do that cross-border payment, more space to put your information, but also it's much more structured than before. So there's less what they call a bit of free format allowed. It's really clearly defined where what should go in, and also in market practices. And why is that important? Because if computers are used, and if you want to do, everybody knows that there's quite some compliance requirements on cross-border payments. If you want to do sanction screening, fraud management, you really need to know where the information is by which you need to verify. And if that's really all organized and well structured, well, the chance that you miss one of those or that you can process it faster is there. Yeah, you know exactly what you're looking for, exactly what information. So the structure within the fields. And then the other advantage is that there are more fields and more information allowed next to the limited standards that were there before. So if in trade, if in cross-border payments, you need to add, I don't know, a number of an invoice or other information, which is crucial to support that payment, you can actually add that in that field. So that means not only that the standard is extended, but also that banks and market infrastructures like John with the Bank of England, but also many others, it's not only about exchanging more information, that also and implement that new standard, but the issue is also that now banks and potentially market infrastructure, but definitely banks will have to capture more data from their customers. If you want to add more information in the message, well, you need to get that information somewhere first. So probably you'll have to ask, in this case, for example, a corporate, for that additional information to be added. So it's not only an implementation in the center of the bank or in the center of the market infrastructure to upgrade, but it's also the bank channels, the communication channels towards the customers of the banks that will have to evolve in order to collect that additional information, and for that information to be held in a message and then to be exchanged with each other. So big benefits, I think, are speed, because if the data is in a better place, is more structured and organized, the speed of processing should increase. The speed on compliance, but also the accuracy of doing compliance, so less transactions that go in a queue where they need to be manually reviewed. So also that speed element is there. Then I think more value, because you exchange more kind of information, not only the basic information. And then I think the ISO 20022 dictionary helps the whole community to align and to do business by providing having the right definition about the same business concepts. I think there's going to be less confusion about what is meant into some of the messages. And so that structure, more transparent and more correct information should help on as well processing as customer service to the corporates and everybody who's still receiving the transaction, and into the whole FCC or the compliance requirements that everybody has.
Thank you, Saskia. That was a really, really, really comprehensive answer. John.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, it's better, much better.
As you say, I had to go to the backup. It's always good to have a live backup. Sorry about that on the previous answer. Yeah, just to add a couple of things, because as you say, I think that's super comprehensive. Just some of the implications of that interoperability. I think one of the implications is there's a potential resilience benefit, which is to say, if multiple systems, particularly say both retail and wholesale systems in a country, are on the same messaging standards, it's much easier to reroute in case of a kind of operational outage or some other kind of contingency scenario. That kind of, I think also the fact that if there are multiple systems around the world or in a country using the same standards, the kind of incremental cost of onboarding to each one of those, the costs of just doing business in multiple countries, hopefully goes down because you can use the same technology, the same implementation, the same business rules and everything, right across the piece. Now, it's not like we've had none of that in the past. The MT standard has acted a bit like that, but the MT standard has been very focused on wholesale, and then there've been other standards in retail. And I think if you can bring all sorts of different payment journeys onto the same standards, then you're really reducing the costs of acting in multiple systems. And then I think the kind of way ISO is structured, I think really lends itself much more than in previous standards to kind of using the same data dictionary and the same data fields in APIs as you do in financial messages, which I think is also kind of makes it a lot more future-proof. That's the kind of one of the major ways in which information exchange is going to change over time in finance, and so I think it does a good job of integrating API and messaging together more.
Thank you, John. I always try to gather some of your answers and to have like a, let's not say a discussion or a conclusion or a wrap up of something. Both of you, without knowing perhaps, you mentioned something or are going to something which is very, very interesting nowadays, which is we have P2P payments, I mean, person to person, peer-to-peer payments. We have P2 merchant, I mean, consumer to merchant or P2B. We also have government to P, well, so on and so forth. But right now we're seeing, or we're talking about things as machine to machine payments. So if your refrigerator has already like an AI camera that can detect that there's missing milk, and the refrigerator has to go to, I don't know, to Costco or to I would send a message saying, hey, we need milk. I'm going to make the payment outright to deduct the money from you, John, to make the transfer to Costco. Then most likely I understand that it's the ISO 20022, which is going to, let's say, to be the mainstay of this messaging system, because it will allow you to have a lot of fields which are richer to fill by the payment by the banks or the financial market infrastructures. Is that the case? I mean, that's what you meant also when you, John, you asked about future proof. I mean, to be able to start doing things as interesting as this.
Yeah, I think so. I was probably meaning a step before that and just saying our participants want to exchange APIs, might want to initiate payments through APIs as well as through traditional messaging, and the same data elements will translate between the two well. But I think you're right, and I'm not an expert on this, but I think the way ISO works with XML, I think that makes it very compatible with a much broader category of systems like ERP systems and things like that. So I think, but Saskia probably knows more about this than I do, that you're right to say that by having these standardized fields and by having this more modern way of capturing the information, it's going to be more compatible with, the type of software that might get installed in your smart fridge one day, Carlos. I think.
Thank you, Saskia. Anything about this?
Yeah, well, I think first of all, John is right. Yes, a few elements to add is indeed, I think also cards, fintechs, it's an open standard, so anybody can use it. And the more people adopt ISO 20022, the more interoperability will be there, because in the end, you know, this is all done for the consumer, whether it's consumer or corporate, for the customer. And the customer wants to have choice of payment means. He wants to make a choice, and he wants to, if, you know, if I send money to you, Carlos, you know, you might choose a different means to receive the money than I have been using to send it to you. There needs to be interoperability, because that is what the customer wants. So that's correct. And then adoption is for everyone, but I also think it's an easier language that can be manipulated by modern software. Manipulate is maybe a bad word, but it can map into other formats more easily. Remember when I said the field is more structured, so that allows for, if in another message or API or whatever format, you need to map it into something else, it's more easy to do. So that also guarantees interoperability, even if not everybody would be using exactly the same standard. The fact that somebody uses ISO 20022 will allow for easier mapping. And maybe also what I wanted to say is that, you know, not everybody will do the migration to ISO 20022 at the same time. You mentioned in the intro, Carlos, that it's going to be between now or March, most of them. Some actually already implemented, but maybe an older version, at least some did an older version. But still, you know, people start now, market infrastructures, and there will still be market infrastructures in 2025 doing the last migration. That means that some will be working with the old standard, some will be working with the new standard. So correct, because ISO 20022 is structured also from a Swift perspective, we have created that, what we call an inflow translator, which makes sure that if somebody sends that ISO 20022 message, it's mapped into the older standard for the banks that have not migrated yet, because that market infrastructure has not migrated yet. And in general, we see this migration being done, I would say, more or less country by country, because the market infrastructure, the ArcGIS in the country, is migrating to ISO 20022, and hence all the participants migrate at the same time. So there needs to be a period now of you know, having the old standard and the new standard coexist. Coexistence period, that was the word I was looking for. And so the fact that ISO 20022 is there makes that mapping to that older standard or any other standard used by anybody a bit easier, at least.
That's great, Saskia. I mean, both of your answers sound a lot like network effects, right? I mean, that's the whole point of having a standard, to gain network effects. The next question that I have, I think that you already addressed a little bit about it, which is about the benefits if they go beyond traditional financial institutions. If new, let's say, fintechs or new market entrants to the payment system will be benefited. Perhaps you already have mentioned something, so we can do this one rather shortly. Saskia, let's go with you.
Yes, so indeed, anybody can use ISO 20022, but not only everybody. Also, like John, I think, already referred to, APIs. Yeah, it's not only going to be messaging anymore. API using the ISO 20022 standard. Also, if we look at, you know, digital currencies, CBDCs, we also see there the discussion about using the same data elements that are ISO 20022 based to guarantee also interoperability. So I would encourage any fintech looking at something brand new to develop, well, at least start with the same standard to guarantee later on interoperability with any other product. Because that's, you know, if you look at it from a customer perspective, that's what your customer is going to expect to happen.
Great. John, I remembered from the last broadcast that we had about the Bank of England or TGS modernization program, that one of the objectives is to be able to accommodate any type of financial, I mean, any type of participant, I mean, authorized participant, no matter which ledger system it uses. It could be a blockchain, it could be a centralized ledger, it could be anything. It is also related to this, right? To be able to accommodate or to have participants such as fintechs, new entrants, so on and so forth, right?
I think that's right, yeah. I think like the benefits we've talked about kind of apply to anyone old or new, but I think the kind of global adoption in a fairly short period of time, you know, from a lot of infrastructures of ISO is particularly beneficial if you're looking to start anew, because you can almost just go and build in this one common language, and you face a lot less sort of, yeah, the network effects are particularly useful if you're starting out or coming afresh. And I think potentially also you can then start building your systems to deal with the richer data, whereas traditional financial institutions will really benefit from this. But as Saskia alluded to earlier, there's a pretty heavy amount of kind of transition to the new standard that you need to do if your system's already configured on the old standard, that is painful, and is why it's taken quite a long time from the idea of adopting ISO to the reality in lots of market infrastructures in cross-border correspondent banking. So I think it's been all the benefits are there for everybody, but I think it probably is particularly beneficial if you're able to start afresh with your technology and your data models and things.
That's great, John. Thank you. Next question has to do with what are the changes bringing to the people in the UK, in the case of Bank of England, and about around the world for you, Saskia? And are these changes going to be noticed, or are they going to benefit directly consumers and firms? Let's go with you, Saskia.
Okay. Well, that's a very broad question. First of all, I think so. As I mentioned earlier, every single market infrastructure will, over the course of the next couple of years, migrate. If you think about, well, I'll leave John to give his view on the Bank of England. That's better. But you know, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and then of course Target 2 and Euro 1 in Europe will all migrate March 20. So this year. I think in the US, one will migrate in this year. The Fed now will migrate in 2025. So in that short time frame, we'll see migrations of MIs. But the ISO 20022 standard actually incorporates more. There is also a bit of a migration. Remember somewhere in one of the first questions, it extends also to corporates. So that means that in the communication between the bank and the corporate, there is also a migration required to ISO 20022. And sometimes when I'm in panels, you know, I do a call out to any corporate there to say, start thinking now, don't wait until every bank and every market infrastructure has migrated to start thinking about ISO 20022. So corporates, front ends, you know, all of those will also have to migrate to ISO 20022, because if they don't capture that data, or a payment, a PSP, you know, sending a transaction to a bank, well, if you haven't captured the data in the front end, it's not going to really be, you know, using the value of ISO 20022 being the additional data and the structured data. So it's the end-to-end payment chain that needs to migrate. So the corporate front end, but it's also about the clearing and settlement, of course, with the market infrastructures, also the reporting, the exceptions and investigations way of doing things will, remittances, direct debits, all of those things will have to be upgraded as there will be more and more structured information. So it's a worldwide movement happening. So that's one. The second is that I think, and that's a bit from the perspective of the G20, every market will still have a bit of a flavor of its own of ISO 20022. And so there is going to also be a kind of an exercise of, can we even harmonize further? You know, are these different flavors still really required? Because, you know, it's always a risk having, if we think about 200 countries around the world, a bit more probably, 220, if about 220 start having flavors, you know, we run a little bit, again, the risk that people might misunderstand each other. But, you know, for the time being, I hope that doesn't happen. But still, I mean, we really need to look at harmonization, making sure we all stay on the same version of ISO 20022 and not one going really fast in new versions and then the other one not upgrading in different versions. So it's also in the future, we'll have to all really work together to make sure that we upgrade to a newer version in the future over the coming years all together, that we make changes all together and not again go in different directions. So there's also a future outlook of how do we maintain that, how do we continue with that harmonization, which is now a very big effort happening in a very short time frame. But let's keep, the reasons why we do this really good in our head, and going forward, keep the best of ISO 20022 and the future developments on the harmonized structure and organization.
Thank you, Saskia. John.
So the situation in the UK is that we're due to put ISO 20022 live for chaps on the 20th of June this year. So a bit less than 5 months. The sequencing here is that we wanted to go aligned with other major market infrastructures and with SWIFT on the correspondent banking, but not at the same time, because it's, for all the reasons we've said, it's a big change to implement in any market, in any infrastructure. And so there's a real clear steer from the industry of saying, try and be close, because if you go at vastly different times, you can get all sorts of data truncation issues, but don't go on the same day, because we want to focus our efforts a bit sequentially on the big transitions. So Saskia mentioned kind of correspondent banking, Target 2, Euro 1, various other countries going live in March, and then we're expecting, after a series of dress rehearsals and things like that, to go live in June, 20th of June. After that, from a Bank of England chaps perspective, the big next part of the process is to start incrementally pushing the envelope on how much we use the enhanced data. So we've got some market guidance we've set out about our intentions there. There's sort of 5 areas of enhanced data. So I guess what that's saying is you've got all this extra capacity, these extra fields and the extra lengths in the fields, but it's not straightforward for everyone to have the data to put into them on day one. And we want to go for a kind of achievable, but relatively ambitious sort of timescale in which people gradually build more bits of data into the field. So, for example, purpose codes, where you can set out the underlying purpose of the payment, those can be put in as soon as we put the standard live in 2023. But we're going to start mandating various types of payment purpose codes on particular types of payment, like purpose codes for payments between financial institutions, payments involving a property transaction, from summer 2024, for example. Similarly, with LEIs and including LEIs in the message as another identifier of the payer and payee. We're planning again to sort of, that's available straight away, but we're planning then to gradually bring in that requirement. And it's the same with some of the structured address fields, some of the structured remittance data, and things like that. So I think that's the next stage, and it fits in with what Saskia was saying about there's the next stage individually, and then trying to coordinate those type of things with other countries, and then coordinating the moves to different versions. And ultimately, I think we need some governance that we don't yet have now about how we govern market practice for ISO 20022 in wholesale applications, or however we kind of put a ring around it. But that's I think another next stage. And then finally in the UK, I think the other ambition, which is kind of waiting on the development of the new retail platforms in the UK, is to try and use this common credit message, so that the ISO flowing through chaps and then the ISO flowing through systems like the replacements for faster payments and for backs is also in ISO format, so you get these rerouting benefits I mentioned earlier, things like that.
So that last part that you just mentioned, John, have to do with the benefits that consumers and firms will get. I mean, if for instance, that kind of new and broader information is included in fast payment systems, for instance, they will have a lot more to information. I mean, not only for the banks to process it, but also for the people to be able to make their payments as well. So I think that's part also of how consumers and firms can benefit from this new standard. The next question is, where are we now in the adoption process? I mean, where are Bank of England chaps and SWIFT in the process of ISO adoption? Let's go with you, John, first.
I think I sort of covered quite a bit of that in my previous answer, didn't I? So I think we're in this, we've built the technological infrastructure to carry ISO. Our participants have done the same, and we're now in the kind of final stages of careful testing and rehearsal before we go live. We're coming in at a time which, as Saskia said, is with a big group of infrastructures and who are coming through together. But then, as you say, there's quite a long tail to run through. And then I think, yeah, we're at that point of saying, okay, now let's focus on adoption, not just moving to the standard, but actually adoption of the potential benefits. And let's get into a feedback loop of people starting to use it, starting to get richer data, and then saying, oh, I now realize that I want this piece of information as well. Let's feed it back into the governance process for standards. Let's get it in there and let's work out the timelines. And I hope there will be a good few years of that, a good few years of sort of bedding in and people realizing what it can do and the ambition growing and the standard being iterated.
Thank you, John. Saskia.
So the question, where are we now? I think, well, first of all, John mentioned the MIs are migrating. SWIFT itself for replacing the MT standards, the old MT standards for cross-border with the CBPR Plus, the ISO 20022 equivalent for cross-border and reporting messages. So we will do that ourselves as well. But then I think we'll also be focused now until end 2025 on translation. SWIFT guarantees the inflow translation because indeed everybody has his own timeline. So we do need, even in those next 3 years to come, guarantee that the customers can still execute a cross-border payment. So we will support that by guaranteeing an inflow translation. But also, as there will be much more information available, and John referred to it, to truncation, so that if somebody sends a very rich ISO 20022 message and there is information that has to be dropped because the other bank or the other party market infrastructure is using still the MT version, well, SWIFT has built a new platform which will capture and keep that data safely. So if even the bank or market infrastructure receives not all the information, it can always, on the new platform of SWIFT, get all that data that it needs. And also it can make a choice at the same time of thinking not only about this ISO 20022 migration as this is a migration of standard. Yeah, finished. No, what we have done with the community is also think about what's the future of all of this. So indeed, and John referred to it earlier as well, we will also give the optionality of using APIs and even the freedom. So if a market infrastructure or a bank, one is using APIs and the other one is using still messaging, well, we will guarantee that interoperability because that data is there, and we will give it or to the bank or to the MI or whoever in the technology that he or she needs, the technology that is required for them to process that transaction. So that as well, I think we'll see, you mentioned earlier, can fintechs use ISO 20022? Well, they will probably go straight to APIs. Some might still, with legacy systems, still use messaging. So we guarantee that interoperability, we guarantee the protection of that data, and that data to be available to everybody in the whole payment chain, even if some of them do not yet have that capability of taking all the ISO 20022 data elements into their processing. At least they have access to them over our new platform, which will make that possible end to end to have a view on the entire transaction, to make it faster and more transparent for everybody. But that will indeed, to John's earlier point, that will take a bit of time for everybody to do. And then indeed to add more and more of that additional information into the ISO 20022 messages over the coming years. Because I don't think everybody will start with full loaded information, ISO 20022 messages with all data elements filled.
Thank you, Saskia. I think that we have addressed all like the topics that we had in our questions, so we can start addressing those questions by the audience. But before I would like to, and there's something that if I'm not wrong, Saskia, you mentioned before the beginning, which is CBDCs, and this is a recurring topic in our FNA broadcast, in the CBDC broadcast, to be precise about it. And I think I saw a document a couple of days or weeks from Bank of England requesting for allowing the private sector to make like suggestions or to make some kind of proposal about what the mobile wallets for a CBDC would look like and contain. I wonder if this is something that the Bank of England would expect to have, that those mobile wallets have APIs that communicate using the ISO 20022. I'm not raising the question to you, John, because I'm not sure if you're on top of the CBDC part of Bank of England or in this research project, but I wonder if that's something that should be already be taken into account by those who are planning to provide or to the service or the like the proposals to how a mobile wallet for CBDC should look like. That's something which I find really interesting to check in Bank of England's document.
Carlos, maybe outside of the Bank of England, and I'll let John do the reply to that. But overall, I think from a SWIFT perspective, where we are really focused on guaranteeing interoperability between payment means, but also on a global scale, we have been actually, although we are not involved in the design of CBDCs, these are domestic designs. Yeah, it's a country deciding to do a digital euro or a digital dollar, digital pound. But what we have been telling since, or working with all the institutions that look at CBDCs, is to say, indeed, look at the number of elements which are crucial. Although this will be in the first instance a domestic implementation, the CBDC, please think in the design already at future cross-border usage. Hence, please use ISO 20022, or at least the data elements of ISO 20022 to guarantee interoperability in the future with the payment means that exist today, because they might need an RTGS access as well. They might need an ACH access as well, you know, to the bank account of the customers or to any other payment mean that is out there. So absolutely, we promote the use of that ISO standard also for future new payment means, including CBDCs.
Yeah, and I would add.
Thank you, Saskia.
I would add that you're right, Carlos. I'm not super close to precise thinking on the CBDC side, but you know, we, from an RTGS operations perspective, we think our existing wholesale CBDC is adopting ISO on the 20th of June. And I think you're right to say that it would make sense for any new entrant payment system like a potential sterling retail CBDC to adopt ISO 20022, because you then start getting the network benefits, the interoperability benefits, that type of thing. So I think I agree with you.
Thank you, John and Saskia. I'm going to address those from the audience. First one is, how will ISO 20022 improve AML and know your client practices?
I think, shall I go first on that? I think it is about, and Saskia referred to this earlier, it's about having better data and having, particularly, I think, actually, not richness is important, but I think the predictability of where data is going to be and how it's going to be structured. It will mean that all these kind of accidental, you know, picking up of an error where, you know, a particular word appears in the street name, which is associated with a country that has sanctions applied to it. The street is not in that country, but it gets flagged anyway. And I think once you have more structure around your data, for example, those things should not come up as false positives. And so I think it is structure first and then later rich data that means all the automated processing of payments that currently happens should have a much lower kind of error rate, because it should be much more predictable. It should be much easier to focus on crucial fields and, you know, not have these sort of miscategorization errors, that the information appeared somewhere you didn't expect it, or you weren't able to differentiate whether that information was relevant to you or not, so you had to assume the worst. So I think those are the kind of examples where it will be particularly helpful.
Thank you, John. Saskia, anything to add to this?
No, I think John did that very well.
Okay, so let's go to the next one, which is how will ISO 20022 address that some banks are still using some old, I guess, MT messaging when the ISO 20022 is not fully ready yet, and there are like, I mean, that the library of messages in this ISO 222 is not fully ready yet. That's the issue of the question. How will this be possible? I mean, if the library of messages in ISO 222 is not ready, how to make old messaging and new messaging interoperable? Anyone?
Well, Carlos, I can reply to that just on the sense that I said we do the in-flow translator, so we translate back to the old format for those that want to, in order to guarantee, you know, time for everybody to migrate between now and the end of 2025, at least for the cross-border part. I don't know, John.
It's a bit hard to kind of answer in detail without knowing precisely what messages are meant, but I think some of this is what I was alluding to earlier. I think it's certainly right that there's a lot of existence where people have been putting the wrong data in the wrong field for years, and that's made processing a lot harder. And I hope that the structure will help with that. The point about are there use cases that aren't yet properly met in ISO? I mean, all I can say is we're not facing that problem on the CHAPS migration so far, but I'm sure that probably is the case. And I guess it goes back to what you were saying, Saskia, saying, well, this is an open standard. There's a process you can go by. If there's a problem, there's something missing, and you know, people can agree or can be convinced that is important, then that needs to be built in. And I'm sure the questioner is right that there will be this sort of long tail of adoption where there will be, there are teething problems, and there are places in which it's been adopted in some places and not others, and so you're not yet through the problem. But hopefully over time, this issue of misusing fields or not putting the data in the right place will get better. And I think one of the things to mention, and it relates a bit to the other question that's in there as well, which was asking about the uses of data. I think certainly for us at Bank of England, because we're going on this journey of gradually mandating different data elements, I think we will be doing a lot more scrutinizing of what flows through and how people are using the standard than we do with MT now. We won't be doing that real time. It won't be blocking transactions from settling if they don't have the LEI they should have. But I think there will be a lot more focus, and I think the structured nature plus the investment we're making in our MI systems means that I think over time it will be a lot easier, and I think there'll be a lot more energy going into making sure that people don't just adopt the standard, but they adopt it properly and they use it as well as they can.
Thank you, Jan. That's really nice. Saskia as well, thank you very much for joining us. It has been a very interesting conversation about ISO 222. I'm certain that everyone has enjoyed and has profited from this conversation. So thank you once again to you both. So if you want to get in touch with John, Saskia, or myself, you will find in the slides that we share after we finish the broadcast, you will have some links to be able to contact us. This is the end of the 7th FMI broadcast, but do not forget that tomorrow we'll have the 8th one. We have 2 days in a row with the FMI broadcast. Tomorrow we're going to have European Central Bank and Bank de France with Patrick Papsford from European Central Bank and Claudine Harman from Bank de France. The topic is about payments oversight. So let's see each other tomorrow, hopefully. Thank you very much. everyone attending. Saskia, John, thank you very much once again. Have a nice
Thank you,
day.
Carl. Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Carlos, and thank you, John.
Cheers. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye.